Good afternoon. Okay. So, smart metering. About 10 years ago, people started to realize when we talk about smart metering that security is an important topic. That all came basically from the US, from NIST. Because the US government about 10 years ago recognized that the smart grid is part of their grid, and with that critical infrastructure. And basically what we did, what we do with smart metering, we bring at every household, we bring an endpoint of a smart grid into every house. And that means we have millions of endpoints millions of endpoints of a critical infrastructure in every house, which actually opens the attack vector quite dramatically when we come to smart metering. It's not about the smart meter per se. So the data in a single smart meter is in that sense not precious enough to actually get hacked. But if it's possible to hack the smart meter and actually go through the communication channel to the system and compromise then the system, that's where actually the gold pot is, and that's what we have to actually avoid. So that means we have to protect this endpoint of the critical infrastructure in a way that we can say we have done the utmost possible when it comes to security. That is what about 10 years ago started. And after that, obviously also the European Community Commission recognizes that fact that indeed smart metering, since it's now mandated in Europe, is a critical infrastructure and must be protected. And based on that, they have this cybersecurity framework initialized so that the national states have to be aware and make sure that this smart meter infrastructure will be protected in an efficient way. And with this, the whole thing went actually to the individual countries. Each country, when it comes to smart meter rollout, there's a regulator which basically sets the pace, sets the play rule, how that all has to actually work. In one way, they define when smart metering is starting, they define the functionality of a smart metering solution, what can be done with smart metering. Is it only what we call meter to cash, so basically for billing, or is it more? Is it towards then smart grid, so that a meter is not only a billing machine, but also, let's say, acting as an interface to switch loads? All that is actually with that, and as more functionality you bring into a smart meter, as more it is actually critical in terms of security. Maybe you know in Holland was one of the first country which has had a regulation for smart metering, and one of the first country to roll out smart meters. They had in this smart meters, they had a breaker in the gas meter as well as in the electricity meter, and there it was a big debate in the parliament whether that should be allowed or not, because with a breaker in every electricity meter, theoretically, if it's possible to hack this solution, you could switch off the electricity of millions of homes. And finally, they decided, because at that time there were no real security framework in place, to remove the breaker. So smart metering came, but without breakers. That was one of the concerns, how you could actually solve with the whole thing. But other countries then basically started to do their own security frameworks. So Germany did give the job basically to BSI to define not only the security aspect but the whole smart metering solution in Germany. We had the UK with SMETS 1, SMETS 2, the framework there, which included already from the very beginning security aspects. The Dutch had also some security aspects in their DSMR specification. And about 3-4 years ago, when we had the rollout or the tenders to the rollout in Austria, also in Austria, the smart metering security framework were defined. What's interesting in Austria, for example, the mandate was to deliver or to install smart meters there. They were very clear in terms of functionality, what a smart meter must be able to do from daily reads to 15-minute load profile that you can connect, multi-energy meter like water meter, gas meters and so on, that you have a consumer port. And for security there was one single sentence in it. Security means it should be state of the art, which basically means we don't know what to say here. And because of that, the industry or the utilities in Austria said we cannot leave it like this, because what means state of the art? That means nothing in that sense, and we better define it for our own. Then somebody else comes and defines it for us, because then maybe it's not what we actually originally wanted to have. So what they did, they formed the consortium Österreich Energy, and defined in this utility consortium what security means for Austria. And with that, they wrote a specification for security requirements. And then it stopped there in Austria. So we were as an industry, we were very clear what it means in terms of what we have to fulfill, but it was not clear how to certify those products, because that was not defined. Once again, there should be a certification schemata, but it's not really defined what it was. So in that sense, the whole thing was rather evolutionary in that sense, where we had then to say, as an industry, a smart meter industry, it's a dangerous situation for us in terms of two aspects. Aspect number one is, if every country is going to define their own security requirement, we are confronted then with 20 different security requirements in each country. It's a little bit different. How are we going to handle this? And even if that would be something which we could handle, because at the end of the day, you cannot invent 20 times the wheel completely in another way. So in that sense, you could always say the requirements are similar, but what's not similar, if they're going to apply then a security certification, what that means, you have then 20 different security certification. As a vendor, you have maybe 5 smart meters you wanna certify. You have 3-4 communication devices. You have a head-end system. You have an MDM. So it's endless. And for everything you're gonna sell somewhere in a country, you have to do a certification, which means then it's not manageable from a resource point of view, and B, it's not manageable simply for the cost. It's impossible to actually do this. And because of that, we then decided, okay, let's do something at ESMIG. Let's define a baseline for security. And that was basically the start of this security schemata I would like to show you here. As a first step, basically, we looked what's around. So what is around? We already heard Germany, Austria, UK, Holland, or the Netherlands, sorry about that. We had the US with NIST and a few other frameworks which defined security requirements for smart metering. And when you add them all up in terms of product requirement, you come up to 302 security requirements. We put them all in an Excel list. It's a huge Excel list with all the requirements. And what we found out is that most of these requirements were very similar. They talked about very specific implementations. So in UK, they talked about the smart meter, the UK hub. In Germany, they talked about the gateway and the intelligent meters. In Austria, they talked about smart meters and data concentrators and so on. So they had specific implementations in mind, and based on this specific implementation, they applied for this smart metering infrastructure specific security requirements. But you could find that, for example, you have, let's take the smart meter, you have a communication channel to the system, you have a communication channel to multi-energy meters, you have a communication channels into the house. And they basically repeated for all this communication channel, yeah, it must be encrypted, there must be a role-based access system, blah, blah, blah. So, and they repeated that basically for all these requirements, for all the meters in all the country, and at the end you come up with 300 security requirements. But actually, when you take them and you take the essence, the generic requirement and the generic aspects, we were able to basically boil that down to 9 security requirements and 27 sub-requirements. So instead of talking about a specific interface, it needs to be encrypted, needs to be protected against this and this and this, we talked about data in transport, which basically applies for all the data which you can send over any interface. When they talked about in-memory encryption and flash and RAM and God knows what, we talked about data in rest, because the requirements as such is exactly the same. So that's what we did, and in a first step, I should actually be able to switch now. We basically came up with the minimum security requirement for AMI components. That was a specification published 2016, Senelec ETSI, which basically laid the foundation for all that. This can be downloaded at the link for everybody free. And it basically is the summary of those 4 countries and these 3 security frameworks, which we just condensed into one document. It's a document just about 20 pages because it's not so much left. But once again, we had now the requirement how such a security or the minimum baseline for security looks. But again, there were no requirements on how to test the whole thing. And only when you are able to prove that your products actually comply to a certain requirement, then you have basically closed the loop. So with that, in 2016, we were not done. We had then to do the step 2. And the step 2 is basically we had to choose a certification schema to actually test our smart meters. And there were already then was a lot of debate, what is the right schema? Is it common criteria? Is it something else? And finally, we decided for common criteria. And we knew already at that time, common criteria, some people say it's too heavy, some people say maybe not the ideal situation. When you have for components it's okay, but if you have a whole system, how to do that? But still, we decided then for common criteria because it's a well-known framework. People know how to operate, how to test components. So we did that. But what we also did, and that is basically reason for us, we had to agree on a assurance level. What is the right assurance level for a smart meter? In Germany, for example, for the gateway, which is similar to a smart meter, they decided finally to go with an assurance level of 4+, which led to quite a lot of cost for the industry. We talk about $500,000 when you want to certify such a component, and there's by no means it's the money you have to spend to a third party. It's mostly 3/4 or 2/3 at least is internal efforts you have to do to document the thing, to bring the processes up to speed. but we thought that this level is just a little bit too high for an ordinary smart meter. So we went for assurance level 3 with one aspect. You could always call it 3+, which goes a little bit above 3. And we believe that this is, in that sense, a good balance on one hand on the baseline on security requirement, but also something which we can actually bear as an industry when it comes to cost and effort to actually achieve this. Here you see certification costs, which a vendor like Landis+Gyr has to burden when we talk about certification. UK, we talk about 150K. In France, although there is no security requirement in that sense, which is official, but we have an EDIS, as we know, with the market power, they define what they want, and in that sense, that's about what you have to spend as a manufacturer. And we believe that with the common criteria protection profile, which we have now in place, we talk about 80 to 100K per component. In contrast to Germany, as we have said, there we're talking more about 250 and above. It's purely based on the assurance level and what you have to actually go under in the process for this gateway. So in that sense, it doesn't really matter if it's common criteria or another schemata. The level of assurance, if it's called low, medium or advanced, defines the cost for the manufacturer and at the end for the society when it comes to security. But we believe we must have a secure smart grid, and it starts at the endpoint, and that's the reason why we believe as an industry it's the right way to do. And Wilhelm already said it, the breaking news. This common criteria protection profile, we have now passed all the tests. The certification is done in that sense. The only thing which is missing is the paperwork. That will take now a few days so that we have then in a few days our certificate in hand. And that means basically from then on it is possible to certify smart meters according to common criteria protection profile. It's open for the industry, it's open for our customers, for our industry partners to be used as the baseline in Europe. And with that, thank you very much for listening.